Greetings, chess fans. My name is Arturs Neiksans. I'm the leading Latvian Grandmaster, and I'm starting brand new video series with the idea to explain some of the core ideas in every single video, allowing you eventually to become the better player. So in this very first episode, I'm going to present you a simple way how to play the Reti opening from the white's perspective, and after 10 minutes you can just go out there and start playing without any heavy theory. There you go. So we are playing knight f3 here, and our idea essentially is pretty simple. You want to play g3, bishop g2, short castle, and then see what happens. So black cannot immediately punish you with moves like e5, e4, because the pawn on e5 would be under attack. This is simply impossible. And at the club level, there's three main continuations. So d5 by far dominates the response to knight f3. Also, the first move c5 also is quite popular, or your opponent wants to copy you with moves knight f6, also makes perfect sense. So d5. d5's got to be the move. After d5, we want to play g3. Black typically responds with knight f6. We play bishop g2, and black plays e6. So we are going to play short castle, bishop e7, and now you actually have a choice. I think about 90% of your games that will definitely go here. So you have two choices. Choice number one is to go for the so-called King's Indian attack, which is going to be my next video about. You can play d3, short castle, knight e2, c5, and e4. And typically this involves starting some sort of a king's attack. But also after bishop e7 you can play c4, and I think it's quite important that you fight for the center. And now the point is, after d takes on c4, very often you have this tricky check on a4. You see, you give a check on e8, you collect the pawn on c4, and then you grab the center. Not really difficult. So after c4, black typically responds with short castle, and now you protect the pawn on c4 by playing b3. So your idea is to play bishop e2 and then decide what to do with the pawn on d2. Black typically responds with c5, you play bishop b2, and if black plays d4, you can play e3, take the pawn on d4, for example, knight c6, takes, d3, knight e2, rook e1, a3, and you have a simple game. All of your pieces are developed, the game is pretty interesting. Now instead of this, after bishop b2, black will play knight c6. And again, you need to watch out for the move d4. So let's say here, if you're playing knight c3, d4, your knight has to move for the second time, which is not really ideal, and black gains considerable space advantage. That's why here the best course of action is just take on d5. If black takes with the knight, you play knight c3, you're going to figure it out, all of your pieces are developed, and if after c takes on d5, black takes here, now probably you can play d4, stopping this pawn, you play knight c3, rook c1, e3, you're going to figure it out a bit later. So let's go back a bit, look at some of the other scenarios what black might do. Instead of e6, black has some other choices as well, and I think it's very easy for you to remember some of the core principles. You basically never want to allow your opponent to position two pawns in the center by d5 and e5. So if your opponent starts doing something like this, he plays knight e7. You know, he's trying to be really smart about it. He wants to play e5 and establish himself a powerful center. So either you play d4 immediately and you stop him, or again you can use the same idea with c4. So if black plays e5, takes, you can continue moves like knight c3. Now black's set up the knight on d7 feels really weird, and again you have nothing really to worry about. But let's say after c4 he decides to take on c4. There's two maneuvers that you always have to watch out in this position. Again, the maneuver you already saw is queen a4, which is, perfectly reasonable move. You're pinning the knight, you're gaining back the pawn on c4, and then you're going to figure it out. Or sometimes you also might have the opportunity to play knight a3. The point is, you see, black cannot play b5 because you're not only hitting the pawn on c4 but also the pawn on b5. And if black defends the pawn with knight b6, remember this trick. You can take on c4, which is a sacrifice, and after queen a4 check, you see you're checking the king, and you're winning back the knight. And then again, you castle short, you play something like b3, bishop b2, you figure out how do you want to fight for the center. Ideally, d4, e4 is your dream scenario. Not really difficult, is it? So let's go back here, and instead of this, Black could play also something else. A very popular setup at the club level is to play this pawn structure, b7, c6, and d5, which kind of makes sense because you can position your pawn on g2, so the bishop is essentially staring in the face of a pawn chain. But again, your plan remains the same. You play short castle, bishop g4, and now I think this is the moment where you have a lot of freedom. I think the simplest way for you to play is to use some of the elements of the king's din and attack. To be honest, I'm not really sure where ends the Reti and where starts a king's din and attack. These two topics are very, very close to each other. You can play c4, which leads to a sharper game, but I think the best continuation is just to play d3. Your idea is to play knight e2, e4, and the Daxo bishop can go to b2. Not difficult stuff. So let's say black goes knight e7, you go knight e2, black could play either e6 or e5, hard to say whatever your opponent is planning. You play e4, and in this position your idea normally is to play rook e1, take on d5, and try to hit a pawn on e5. Think about also including h3, try to force black to take on f3, giving you the so-called two-bishop advantage. So black can take here, here, again your ideas involve queen e2, a4, knight c4, maybe b3, bishop b2, and then you're going to figure it out. You're out of the opening, you have a great position. Now let's go back here for a moment and see what else does black have. Instead of this, black could play also other moves. For example, black could play knight f6, and of course this is super popular at the club level. Players like to copy their opponent's moves. So you still build the same setup, knight f3, g3, bishop g2, short castle. So the first four moves, you're no need for you to know the theory. Now again you have a choice. You can play either d3, knight e2 and e4 and then see what happens. But still in the style of Reti is to play c4, at least to have some influence to the center. And black could play something like d6. You play knight c3, put the pawn behind the pawn. That is considered to be a good strategy, how you are developing the pieces. And after e5, now you can maybe play some sort of an English setup. Again, not really difficult stuff to play. You want to play rook b1, put the bishop on d2, b4, a4, b5, a5, and play the queen side. Leave the king side alone. That's it. Again, it's very easy, and you're going to get nice positions after the opening. Now let's go back here. Another very popular setup from the black's perspective is to play c5. And remember what I said, try to avoid your opponent getting these two pawns in the center. You don't mind c5 and d5, but you do mind d5 and e5. So that's why here you're still going to play g3, knight c6, you're still going to play bishop g2, but now keep your eyes open what your opponent is planning. So if he plays something like d5, he clearly wants to play e5. He wants to get the perfect center. If this happens, you stop him. You play d4, you play knight e4. Now this position kind of resembles the Grunfeld, only you're playing from the white's perspective, a very popular defense. e5, take it, and even though black has a powerful center, you are seriously disrupting it. I'm talking about moves like knight c3, bishop g5, queen a4. You're asking black a lot of questions. How do you hold on the center here? White's position is simply better. Now that's why this setup from the black's perspective is not really that great. Black could also try to play something like e5, but after c4, knight f6, knight e3, you're clearly influencing the fight for the center, and black no longer gets the same game. You play short castle, d3, maybe play bishop g5, and then essentially see what happens. That's it. I hope you enjoyed this. I would like to remind you, I have also made a full video about the Reti opening. I call it GM Neiksans Boot Camp, the Reti opening. So you can check it out after this video. But of course, if you like the video, please press like and consider subscribing to my channel. Thank you for watching. Arturs signing out.